Hello, my name is Dr. Ominde, and in this lecture series, I'm going to discuss on it in the fetus. This is going to be very brief. So by third month of development, blood vessels are present and they're functioning. And the fetus must receive blood from and to the placenta because metabolic waste have to be taken to the placenta to be exchanged with oxygen and nutrition that is coming from the maternal blood. And there's also resistance of blood flow in the lungs. The resistance is very high because the lungs have not fully developed. Gaseous exchange is not taking place in the lungs. So there's high resistance of blood flow in the pulmonary circulation. So this basically summarizes everything in this lecture. So what happens? Blood from the placenta, okay? Oxygenated blood will be carried from the placenta via umbilical vein. Some of this blood enters the liver and some will enter the ductus venosus into the inferior vena cava. The one that goes to the liver, from the liver back to inferior vena cava. Then inferior vena cava empties into right atrium. Most of the blood from right atrium will get into the left atrium via foramen ovale. This is in the fetus. We don't need a lot of blood going to the lungs, so no need to have a lot of blood going to the right ventricles. Why? Because the lungs have not developed. So most of it from right atrium will go to the left atrium through foramen ovale. Then from left atrium to the left ventricle, which pumps blood out through the aorta and into the systemic circulation, where we also have umbilical vein arteries as part of the systemic circulation, and this will carry deoxygenated blood to the placenta, where exchange will take place. But a little blood entered the right ventricle, so this will be pumped via the pulmonary trunks into the lungs, and via pulmonary veins, the blood will be returned back to the left atrium. Now, but the lungs have not developed. So from the pulmonary trunk, you can return this blood back to the system. No need to take it to the lungs. So majority of this blood actually, through ductus arteriousus, it enters the aorta. So you need to be able to explain fetal circulation. You must mention placenta, umbilical vein and arteries, ductus venosus, and so from the placenta, oxygenated blood is carried by umbilical vein. Then ductus venosus carries this blood from umbilical vein into inferior vena cava. Then most of it will go to the right atrium, to the left atrium via foramen ovale, to the left ventricle, aorta, systemic circulation, then umbilical artery carries the deoxygenated blood back to the placenta. The little that managed to enter the right ventricle will be pumped out through the pulmonary trunk. But since the lungs are not developed, this blood gets back to the aorta through the ductus arteriosus. So basically that's it. So we have the umbilical circulation. This is at the placenta. Then you have umbilical vessels here. So you have a pair of umbilical arteries. Umbilical arteries carry deoxygenated blood and waste from the fetus body to the placenta for exchange, while umbilical vein carries oxygenated blood and nutrients. So the vein carries, placenta is bringing in oxygen to the placenta back to the maternal circulation. So the umbilical artery deoxygenated blood, vein carries oxygenated. And like in the body, arteries carry oxygenated and veins carry deoxygenated blood. So this is the placenta, the maternal surface. Placenta facilitates exchange of nutrients, oxygen, metabolic waste between maternal and fetal blood. But the blood, mother's blood and the baby's blood does not mix. So the umbilical vein, some blood from the umbilical vein actually enters the portal circulation. Therefore, it allows the liver to actually process these nutrients that are coming in. So, umbilical vein, some blood actually enters the liver so that the nutrients can be processed. So this is your liver. You have your umbilical vein that is going to carry some blood into the liver through the portal circulation. Okay, then majority of the blood will enter the ductus venosus. So this is umbilical vein. It has brought blood. Some blood will go through the portal system so that the nutrients are processed, but majority enters ductus venosus and into the inferior vena cava. So majority of the blood enters ductus venosus, and this gives a shunt that bypasses the liver. and puts the blood into the hepatic veins. So your majority of the blood bypasses the liver. It has no business being in the liver, but a small portion of it will enter the liver so that the nutrients can be processed. Then foramen ovale, we had talked about it. You need to shunt blood from the right atrium into the left atrium, from right to left through foramen ovale. So from inferior vena cava, you can see from this arrow, inferior and superior vena cava are bringing in blood to right atrium. Then from right atrium, the blood enters the foramen ovale into the right ventricle. So blood is shunted from right atrium to the left atrium directly so that you're able to skip the lungs. More than a third of the blood will take that route. And usually there is a valve that guards the foramen ovale to prevent backflow from left atrium to right atrium. So ductus arteriosus, where we've talked about ductus venosus, we said umbilical vein will bring blood to the liver, and most of it through ductus venosus enters the inferior vena cava, which will carry the blood to the right atrium. But where is ductus arteriosus? Now, blood that enters the right atrium from inferior, remember, umbilical vein is carrying oxygenated, so red is oxygenated blood. So umbilical vein through ductus venosus, through inferior vena cava, majority of it oxygenated blood through foramen ovale into the left atrium, into the left ventricle, to the arc of the aorta, and to the subclavian and common carotid. So most of this oxygenated blood is going to upper limbs through subclavian, and the carotids will go to the head and neck. So the brain is getting very highly oxygenated blood. Now, venous drainage from the head and neck is we have deoxygenated blood coming in through the superior vena cava. And some of this goes to the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it will be pumped out through the pulmonary trunk. But at the pulmonary trunk, we know the lungs are not developed, so we'll not allow most of the blood to go to the lung. So ductus arteriosus is patent. So it will take this deoxygenated or low oxygen containing blood to the descending aorta. So the lower portion of the body, the systemic circulation from the descending aorta to the lower parts of the body is getting blood with less oxygen compared to the blood that's trunk. And most of this is shunted into the aortic arc. So from the pulmonary trunk to the aortic arc, and it flows downwards to the descending aorta. So what happens at birth? You need to now change from fetal circulation to postnatal circulation. Why? Baby is no longer using placenta after birth, and the lungs are now developed. Oxygenation is being carried out by the lungs, not by the placenta. And this oxygenation is actually initiated when the baby takes the first breath. So there's no more transition from prenatal to postnatal. Okay, so I'll repeat again. Placenta, oxygenated blood comes in through umbilical vein. This oxygenated blood will enter ductus venosus into inferior vena cava. From inferior vena cava, it will enter right atrium. This oxygenated blood is directed to the foramen ovale, enters the left atrium, left ventricle, to the arc of the aorta, and most of this highly oxygenated blood goes to head and neck, the brain, the upper limbs through subclavian and carotid. Then venous drainage from this upper part of the body mostly through the superior vena cava, yeah, and it has less oxygen. So most of it will go to this one that's coming from superior vena cava will go to the right ventricle, to the pulmonary trunk, but cannot go to the pulmonary arteries because there's high resistance. The lungs are not developed. So ductus arteriosus is patent, and it will now start emptying this blood less of oxygen. So there is now mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated at this level. The lower part of the body is getting less oxygenated blood. So postnatally, what happens? Foramen ovale closes shortly after birth, okay? And it starts closing shortly after birth and completely by the first year. Then ductus arteriosus, what happens to it? It closes after birth. By 3 months, it has closed, and it now forms ligamentum arteriosum. Ductus venosus closes, degenerates, and becomes ligamentum venosus of the liver. Then what happens to the umbilical arteries? They form the medial umbilical ligament on the anterior abdominal wall. So arteries degenerate and form medial umbilical ligaments, while umbilical vein forms the ligamentum teres. So when we ask you, discuss the changes that occur from prenatal to postnatal circulation, these are the changes. So In case there is persistence of fetal circulation, in what cases? When you have a patent ductus arteriosus or a patent foramen ovale, this can occur. So ductus arteriosus fails to close or foramen ovale fails to close. This gives you congenital defects. And in this case, it means you're going to mix oxygenated with deoxygenated blood, and the baby will have cyanosis. Therefore, you need surgical correction by the age of 2 because the needs of the baby, oxygen needs are high, so you need to close it. So many of these defects actually go undetected until the child is at least of the school age in terms of this patent foramen ovale and ductus arteriosus. So basically that describes the fetal circulation. So go back to the video and listen to it over and over until you can describe the fetal circulation and the changes that occur from prenatal to postnatal period. Thank you very much.